Morning, everyone. Welcome to the risk class. I believe we've got about 45 minutes, so I'm going to just jump right in. My name is Yuval Bar-Or. As you can see, I'm a professor at the Carey Business School. I have been teaching here for about 6 years, mostly finance courses and risk-related courses. So, by way of introduction, we know that the world is an uncertain place. To thrive and often just to scratch out a living and survive, we all have to grapple with, wrestle with, and overcome many, many risks. Case in point, I got a paper cut this morning. So there are treacherous risks out there. The most successful among us, rather, are those who make good decisions in the face of all that risk and recognize the presence of risk as opportunity. So we don't just seize up and get paralyzed in the face of risk. We take proactive steps where others don't. So it gives us an advantage over them. I should mention that this is intended to be an informal session, so please do interrupt, ask questions, throw things as long as they're not hard-edged or sharp. So having said that, let's open this up. What do you see? How many people say glass half full? Predictable. How many people say something else? Please. Or do you have something else to suggest, or half empty? Anybody else? Half empties? Any other suggestions? Glass with water. You feel thirsty? All right. Please. Two glasses. Oh, all right. Whoa. I got to check my glasses. There's it. Hadn't thought of that one. Very good. Very good. Yes. Any other suggestions? Okay. So. Not surprisingly, yes, I assumed that people would go down that path. So the pessimist, of course, in our traditional thinking would view this as glass half empty. The optimist would view this as glass half full. To make this more relevant to the risk management world, what would the risk manager say? Please. So how not to lose the remaining half of the water. Any other thoughts? Please. Opportunity? In what particular sense?
You can't have opportunity without the risk. So,
Okay. Any other thoughts? All right, more generically, sort of we're going back to the philosophy of what a risk manager would think, the risk manager is thinking, what will it look like tomorrow? Right? This introduces the notion of uncertainty. Will it be exactly the same? Will it be more full? Will it be less full? Or potentially when we show up, will the glass be on the ground crushed into 1,000 pieces? So the risk manager can't just look at the way things are. The risk manager must think about what they may be in the future. We also didn't actually load this up with any judgments about whether half-filled glass is good or bad. Having less water may actually be a good thing. We haven't actually set up the entire scenario. We assume that having more water is a good thing, but that's not necessarily the case. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a way to get our brains moving a little bit. Back to sort of the mainstream presentation, what is risk? The word risk originates from the early Italian, risicare. I may be pronouncing that wrong. I'm happy to be corrected. The meaning is to dare. Risk, for our purposes, there are more fancy definitions, but for our purposes here, risk is the presence of uncertainty, so the potential for multiple outcomes in the future, where at least one of them is bad. Bad, of course, is also potentially a judgment. So we will define bad as anything in which we suffer a loss or damage, a financial loss or physical damage, could be emotional damage and so on. We can also decompose risk into two dimensions. The probability of that bad outcome occurring, is it 80% or 5%? And the severity of that bad outcome if, in fact, it does occur. Why is it important to make that decomposition? Any thoughts? Please.
They inform how much effort you put into trying to mitigate that risk.
Right? Yep, absolutely. Right? at the very least, allows us to be more surgical in our responses. It means that we don't just have to look at the presence of uncertainty and get weak in the knees, but we can think very carefully about, well, what can I do about reducing the probability? What can I do about reducing the severity? So I can allow the probability to manifest, the bad realization to manifest, but if I can reduce the loss I'm going to suffer, then I don't really need to worry about it. That is why banks lend money in the form of mortgages, with collateral being the asset itself, the house. Because if the borrower does in fact default, it's not a trivial issue for the bank, but if they're getting the house, they have an asset and their ultimate loss may be minimal. So always useful to keep those two distinctions in mind. Here's an example, bank lending to a corporation. From the lender's perspective, this gives rise to what we would call credit risk. The first dimension of the risk is the likelihood the corporation, the borrower, will run into financial difficulties and may not make all of the interest or principal payments. And the second dimension in this case is the severity. How much money will the bank ultimately recover? There are many other risk types, and the taxonomies, the different classification systems for risk types are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That's one of the confusing elements in the field. For our purposes, I've thrown out some of these. You may have heard of them. You've probably heard of market risk. So when you're watching tickers go across the screen, you're watching S&P 500 or some other index as it's moving up or down, what you're seeing is the manifestation of the underlying risk as the variability and the volatility appears on screen. Legal risk has to do with losses due to legal liability, health risk, which includes both emotional and physical damage or injury, and reputation risk, which turns out to be actually a very important one. So I've defined it here as the risk of decline in public standing, but any issue in which we feel that we've lost face or lost the faith of the public is all potentially reputation risk. The science of risk is fascinating and important and complicated because it lies at the intersection of so many fields. So the ones I've put on screen here include psychology, sociology, anthropology, the decision sciences, neurology, where we would actually get into the biology of how does the brain function, how are decisions processed correctly or incorrectly, and statistics. Statistics may be one of the more obvious fields you would think of, but there are many others. Note that I haven't even put down the typical management sciences relating to risk. So there are many, many different risks, but specifically they overlap and are related to many, many different fields of study. That's one of the benefits of being a scholar of risk or being a risk manager. You can engage in any conversation with anybody at any time because there's risk everywhere. Any situation, business, personal, has always got risk. So being able to put on that hat of the risk manager and identifying the risk and talking about it allows you a seat at the table. The fact that risk managers tend to be underappreciated and somewhat disrespected is a whole other issue. It partly explains why we have bubbles and why we have subprime debacles and so on. So one of the things that is of concern, of course, regarding risk is it can make us very fearful, and that causes various reactions, including paralysis. We might freeze and refuse to make a decision or be unable to make a decision. It can force us to lose confidence in the system, in ourselves. It can force us to become defensive and overreact. We see that sometimes in political reactions to events that scare the public. In fact, we see that everywhere. Many people, in fact, react this way. So this is, and some of you may recognize this as the scream, which seems appropriate. So why are we so bad at risk? This is the second component of today's presentation. And I've got a stream now of slides that's going to take us through various reasons why we are not so good at processing risks, identifying them, quantifying them, and doing something constructive about them. Before I move on, any questions? Anything? Okay. So one of the reasons is that we waste time on the wrong debates. Right? We often are caught up in the question of is risk good or bad. We see examples of that by politicians who try to ban financial products, such as CDOs, credit default swaps. CDOs are collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, financial options, calls and puts. Each of these has at one time or another come under fire, and there have been calls from the public and from the political sphere to ban them outright or significantly restrict them. In response, let's refer to it as Wall Street, has come up with a very particular argument. Does anyone recognize or recall what that argument is? Please.
Say, risk management.
I'm sorry, risk management is?
You know, the risk management instruments, you have options, CDS,
Right.
cover against a lot.
Absolutely. Any other arguments by Wall Street? It's sort of general argument that they often apply in sort of blanket form. Of course, when I say Wall Street, I'm not just referring to the one street in New York. I'm referring to the industry in general, represented in every major city, every major money center institution. Please. Diversification in what sense?
You could have stocks, bonds, insurance, different ways to mitigate when it fails, what succeeds.
Right. So there is a value to having more instruments in general. The expression I'm looking for is innovation. Some of you may recall hearing that. There's always a talking head from the financial services industry who will say, oh, by instituting more regulations, this is stifling innovation. It's stifling our ability to innovate, to create more products that have risk management uses or various other applications that could be good for society. We don't have enough time. We don't have the weeks necessary to debate whether that's true or how much of it is true. It's a loaded subject, but it does very much play a role in the overall debate of how do we treat risk. And the main message here is, to repeat a comment I made before, risk is everywhere. It is a fact of life. We cannot avoid risk. When I come out of my house in the morning and walk to the curb, there is a risk that some car will drive recklessly and hit me. I could, in response, decide that I'm going to stay in the house and not stick my nose out the door. A part of an aircraft could land on my home. The entire aircraft could land on my home. And I'm not saying that jokingly, or at least not fully, because these things have happened. So there is no place on this planet that's fully 100% safe and will protect us against all risks. To live life, we have to face risks. So I'm suggesting that the moniker, the label of risk is good or bad is completely inappropriate. Risk simply is. It's everywhere. We can't avoid it. We can't live life to the fullest unless we accept some risks. So the appropriate way to think about entering a judgment here is looking at the risk-taking. Is the risk-taking reasonable? Is it reckless? Is it ill-advised? Is it wise? That's where I think that judgment applies, not just the risk itself. So going back to some of the comments that were made, CDOs, CDSs, options, and various other financial instruments and decisions all have their uses. They all have constructive uses. They also can have speculative, very destructive uses, as we've seen. But it's important for us to have open, intelligent conversations about all the aspects of all of these products and make sure that we are using them responsibly and that we're counseling others to use them responsibly. Any thoughts on that? Okay. Please.
Do you subscribe to the thinking that the greater the risk, the greater the reward, or is that thinking that's supported in the literature at all?
Well, that is, excuse me, one of the main beliefs or concepts in the field of risk, that risk should be commensurate with return. A little farther on here, I do make a comment about the importance of making decisions always keeping both of those elements in mind, both the risk and the return. We run into trouble because there are always folks with an agenda to tell us the return is high and the risk is low, and it's dangerous for us as thinking human beings to just accept that at face value. So we should always be challenging those notions. We should always be asking, okay, you've given me some information about the return, but could that be inflated because I realize there may be an agenda or a reason to inflate that for me? And similarly, looking at whatever risk measures come out, we have to be very objective and critical and say, wait a minute, are you telling me about all the risks? Does this measure, in fact, incorporate everything I need to know? So both of them must be considered, and they must be considered simultaneously. And we'll get to that momentarily. Any other thoughts on that subject? Okay. So remember, we're going through all the reasons why we're not very good at handling risk. This was the introduction to that. So we're also not proactive. So this is a cartoon that I had made. I do a lot of lecturing to medical professionals. So this is a reminder that life insurance, you can't buy it after you're dead. That's what I mean by proactive. So you've got to think ahead. You've got to make the right decisions. And that's the correct way to deal with risk. Here's the point that was just brought up. We forget to consider risk and return simultaneously, even though we absolutely must do that. So I was not long ago at a meeting in which there were about 50 or 60 financial advisors, and they were being told about a new annuity product. The meeting lasted an hour. They got hugely excited about all the returns that were promised, and not a single one of them ever asked, what are the risks? And so they got all caught up in the returns. It was exciting for them. They were looking forward to having these conversations with their clients, but they didn't ask a single question about what the risks were. Obviously, that's a problem, because when they actually get in front of their clients, we want them to be providing that information as well. Otherwise, the clients are not being given this opportunity. So we also like to KISS, and I do have my own meaning of KISS here in case it's ambiguous. We referring to the expression in English, keep it simple. Our brains have evolved in such a way that we like to deal with risks in a particular way, precisely because it causes us anxiety. Uncertainty, fear, and so on, all are related to anxiety, and as human beings, we resent that. We don't want it. We try to escape the anxiety. It doesn't make us feel good. It's a defense mechanism. We could go back through human evolution, evolutionary psychology, neurology, and so on to explain that. But I don't think it's controversial to suggest that we want to avoid anxiety. That's why we procrastinate, because we think that if we don't think about something, the anxiety will go away and we'll feel better. But that, of course, is just a short-term fix. Part of anxiety comes in when we're faced with all these multiple choices and we're not prepared to handle them. And so we have a natural tendency to keep things very simple. We try to make everything as simplistic as possible because it's easier to handle, or at least it seems to be easier to handle. And one of the manifestations of that in the world of risk management is that we seek to summarize risk with a single number or a single label. What's an example of that? Anyone think of a single number or a measure that's often thrown around as a measure of risk? Please. Standard deviation, exactly right. A measure of total return or total variability. A credit score, right, precisely. Right. So we have retail credit scores such as those provided by FICO. We have rating agency credit scores, the usual scale people are familiar with, AAAs, AA's, single A's, and so on. Oh, right. Oh, very good. Okay. We have the beta measure, which is yet another measure that's attempting to show us the correlation or the movement of a particular security as it relates to some underlying index's movements or market factor. So we have many measures that we've turned to that are meant to tell us, that we like to think are telling us something important about risk. And the problem with all of them is that at least in some circumstances they're going to be wrong. And in all cases they're abstracting away from a lot of important information. So while it's comforting to think that we can just write down the standard deviation in a report and hand that to our boss, or look up the rating agency, the beta, the FICO score, put that in the report and send it up the line, that is not a constructive way to summarize risk. And my argument here is that we should never try to summarize risk with a single number. Delving into that a little bit more, I can create a diagram in which you see these two distributions. One of them is normally distributed, which is to say a Gaussian, and the other is skewed, as you can see the red curve. But I could devise them in such a way that they have exactly the same standard deviation measure. If you calculated, it would be the same number. So if all you sent up the line, the chain of command, to the decision maker is just the number and not the picture, they would never know that it's one or the other. Doesn't it seem really obvious that you'd want to know what the picture looks like? In particular, because we know that if I'm measuring value this way, low values are that way. This could be the value of a bank portfolio, mortgage loans, could be a bond portfolio managed by an investment management firm. The lower value end is the one we worry about. This is the part that indicates losses. The deeper I am in this direction, the lower the value of the portfolio, and some set of these realizations, realized values in the future, correspond to losses, and really big losses. This point here corresponds to the subprime crisis. When enough banks end up with their value down here, we've fallen off the cliff. So this simple diagram can be used to explain every single financial disaster we've had. Why is that? It's because one way or another we convince ourselves that we can assume that some of the underlying uncertainty comes from normal or well-behaved Gaussian distributions. That implies a certain probability, the area under this curve, of the bad things happening. You could see that this curve is almost flat here, indicating there's relatively little probability of the bad stuff happening. That's why we call these 5 sigma events, 6 sigma events, and our models convince us that, oh, that could never happen. When in reality, if this is the true underlying distribution, you could see it's raised up here. There's more area under the red graph on the lower end here, the losses end, indicating there's actually a significantly higher probability of bad stuff happening. But because it's convenient and easy for us to just quote the standard deviation and allow ourselves to assume that the blue distribution prevails, we don't even think about the possibility that these are not 6 sigma events, they're 2 sigma events, which means they're much more likely to happen again and again and again. So the graph that tells us all of the different outcomes, it summarizes all the outcomes and their probability, much more meaningful than any one number we would choose. And we could calculate the mean, we could calculate the median, we could calculate the standard deviation, measures of skew and kurtosis, any measure you could imagine. If you come up with one number, it's not enough to summarize that whole graph. Now, I could have added, in fact, in an article that recently came out, I also added die rolls. Right? I could roll a 6-sided die and have, there's some average result that's likely, and there's some standard deviation that's likely. I could create graphs like these that have the same averages and standard deviations. They would all be completely misleading. Right? There is no way. In the case of the die roll, there would be 6 different values. There would be 6 discrete values here, all with the same probability of 1/6. Right? There is no way that any one of those numbers can summarize all of the information. Right? I think we've made that clear, so we'll move on. That's one of the main problems. Right? We try to keep things too simple, and we miss the bigger picture. We also think that ignoring risk will make it go away. Obviously not a good long-term strategy. Our economic theories assume that we are rational decision makers. Those of you who have studied economics before know that almost always the first line of any economic class you go through, any model you look at, says, assume all players, market players, are rational. Meaning they never make mistakes, they always process all information correctly, come up with the right conclusion, calculate everything to 20 decimal points in their heads. In other words, we all make decisions like this dude here. Sadly, few of us actually think this way, and few of us act this way. Those of you who have spent any time in the workplace know that we make terribly irrational decisions, emotionally driven decisions. Our bosses do it. We do it. We do it for reasons that are embarrassing, that we wouldn't want to admit, for personal, very human reasons. That is a fact of life. And so we also need to remind ourselves that making that rationality assumption is really not serving us well in certain cases. We're also not good at quantifying probabilities, thinking about large numbers, or doing math with large numbers in our heads, solving complex problems. An argument for this comes from the biology and evolution fields. And the argument there is that evolution has prepared us over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, and wired into us in our brains tendencies that protect us from the dangers that we would have faced over those huge periods of time. which would have been natural elements and predators. But 100,000 years ago, plus or minus a million years, there was nothing there that was helping us to address the following, to assess probabilities of stock appreciation or depreciation, complex financial market movements, the possibility that an employee may embezzle, the many different ways that our IT products may collapse, because obviously 100,000 years ago none of those things existed. So in a very real sense, if you believe in evolution and the way it has shaped us psychologically and biologically, physically, in a very real sense, we're completely unprepared for the world that we're living in today. And that explains, of course, a lot of the things that we do as individuals and as societies, which are not very good, which are not very constructive. You know, we hurt each other in many different ways. And the executive part of our brain, which is the more reflective part, the more recently evolved part, is what we rely on to not be impulsive, to think things through, to recognize the risks, and to be tolerant, all the other things that are really important for us. So we need to rely on those capabilities more. And of course, that's one of the main reasons that we have these kinds of schools. We hope to work with you to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction. So there's sadly a long list of reasons still to go. We're susceptible to a variety of psychological biases. These include overconfidence. They include the illusion of control, where we're convinced that we have everything under control when in fact we don't. There are many others. There's the endowment effect, which is that once we own something, we tend to associate a much higher value to it than if we haven't taken ownership of it. Loss aversion, which is the preference on our part not to, in the world of finance, not to book a loss and not to sell something at a loss, because then we're realizing the loss. We have to admit that we've in fact suffered it. As long as we haven't sold, there's still a chance, at least in our minds, that it might recover, and we won't have to admit that it was a loss. So that's what loss aversion is about. We don't have time to go into all of these, but usually these are pretty fascinating items to delve into. There's the notion of value attribution, confirmation bias. Any of you who have psychology backgrounds or research backgrounds know that confirmation bias is an issue. We tend to notice the evidence that confirms our particular pet theory, and even though other evidence exists, we will subconsciously, not for ill intent, but subconsciously, to not really notice it. So, not surprisingly, the evidence that surfaces by our work is the material that confirms our particular beliefs. And there are various biological factors that affect decision-making, which have to do just naturally with aging, disease, fatigue, and so on. And the list goes on. So we've got lots of other biases. Again, you may have heard some of these in the context of various other literatures. There's anchoring. There's something known as framing, the notion of sunk costs that we're averse to. There's regret avoidance, which motivates us to do various things in order to avoid feeling regret. Conformity, the fear of falling out with the group, a very important issue for humans. Because we're social animals. Confirmation bias, in fact, we just saw on the previous screen. There's general risk aversion, the recency effect in which we overweight recent events, general xenophobia, and inexperience. So you can see there is a long list of reasons why we make poor decisions. And every time I go through this, I wonder how we're ever able to make any good decisions, because it just looks like things are so stacked against us. It's actually miraculous that we can make some of those. So now people sometimes go through this type of material and they think, no, that can't be possible. I feel that my brain is fully functional. I feel that I'm able to perceive everything that's relevant around me and to make rational decisions. And so often these are useful little exercises. So here we consider a survey on personality profiles of 100 women. We're told up front that 90 of them are professional athletes and 10 of them are librarians. Now we go through the exercise of mixing all those profiles up and randomly selecting two. And these are the two that I've selected. One of them is Lisa. She's described, as you can see, as outgoing, lively. She has long hair and tan. She's sometimes undisciplined and messy, has an active social life. She's married, no children. And then we have Mildred, who, in contrast, is quiet. She wears glasses, has short hair. She smiles often but seldom laughs. She's a hard worker, very orderly, and she has few close friends and is single. So our first question is, what are the odds that Lisa is a librarian? So let's take those from the crowd. It will not be held against you. Yes, sir? 10% that she's a librarian. Any other thoughts? No other numbers? That's it? 10%? Sorry? 50%? 50? Any others? Slightly less than 10. All right? Okay. No, it's fair enough. It's a reasonable response. Any others? Okay, so we have a range. The second question, what are the odds that Mildred is a professional athlete? 90%. Any others?
Greater than or equal to 90?
What's that? Sorry?
Greater than or equal to 90?
Greater than or equal to 90. All right. Always good to stake out a range. I'm sorry?
Mildred was the first person, right?
Mildred was the second person.
Never mind.
All right. Okay. Let's throw another question in here. If I had the coin and I flipped it 6 times, here are 2 potential sequences, right? Heads, tails, tails, heads, tails, heads, and 6 heads in a row. Which one of these has the higher probability of occurring? We have someone saying same probability. Any other thoughts? Same? Any others? All right, we got same. Here's another one, number 4. Keep in mind this diagram is not drawn to scale. You are not allowed to use your calculators to do this. You're on the honor system. We've got a right-angled triangle. I'll call it the base is a mile long. The vertical bit is measured here as the letter A. That's the unknown. And the hypotenuse, those of you who remember that term, or the slope, is 1 mile plus 1 inch. The question is, what is the size of A? So again, we're using our human brains to just try to apply intuition and come up with a number. Something less than 1 inch? More than 1 inch, let's be a little more specific because that's a big range. So we've got less than 1 inch. We've got just, so like between 1 and 2 inches, something very close to an inch. Okay, any others?
Variable.
How is it variable? True, it's not drawn to scale, but I have given you 2 sides and an angle. Right, we know, so I'm sorry, this is, I said it was I think I said, this is a 90-degree angle here, right? Does anyone want to revise their, just in case, since I may not have made that clear? But that's a right angle in here, 90 degrees. So do you still think it's a variable? No, all right. No, that's good, that's why we do these classes, right? So any other thoughts we had? Oh, yes, please. So really, really close to 1 inch, which may have been what you were suggesting. Other thoughts? Close to 0. Okay. So we've had very, very small numbers, it sounds like, from every. Usually someone shouts out 100 feet or a mile or something. The answer is either very close to 6 feet, 72 inches, or 8 feet. I just can't remember. I think it's 8 feet. So what's it? 8 times 12, 96 inches. Just an example of how our brains look at this and try to grapple with it and come up with an answer that seems right to us. And even the interesting thing about these types of questions, even when I specify that it's not drawn to scale to try to help people not try to size that up just by eyeballing it, it's still very difficult for people to come up with the right answer. Right? That doesn't make us deficient in any way or dumb in any way. It just means that these are not things that are easy for our brains to quantify. And that's really been the point. So going back to some of the answers, the odds that Lisa is a librarian are simply determined by the probabilistic nature of the question. We know that 90% of the people in the sample are professional athletes, and we drew randomly. So the probability that anyone is a librarian is 10%, and the probability that anyone is a professional athlete is 90%. Please. Okay.
You've given us some information on that, and I think it's fair to say that you just put the certain personality types.
Except that because I've stated that this is randomly generated, in effect, it sort of wipes out any of the stereotypical tendencies. Fair enough.
Random means you selected somebody out of a hat. That you randomized the person.
Fair enough. We don't have enough time to delve into it, but I tried to choose my words carefully, so that as I was introducing the question, the answer I just gave would be the mathematically precise answer. Because I think there are probably many women, both in libraries and on athletic fields now, who are a little annoyed that they're being stereotyped by you, in a sense, right? Because they're saying, hey, I have a tan, and I'm married, and I have lots of friends, and I'm a librarian. And some of them are saying, hey, I'm an athlete, and I'm not married, and I'm a little withdrawn, and I wear glasses, and so on. So, and I'm guessing that I won't be able to resolve that fully here and now, so I'm throwing that back, and I welcome the challenge. I think that's good. So, and more are welcome as we go on. Please.
Oh, just to add to that, sir, like if, the librarian happens to be a professional athlete in the past, right, just became a librarian yesterday, practically wiped out that whole theory of, hey, this person may look more like a librarian versus a professional athlete. And professional athletes the same way. If they've been a librarian before in the past, now they're becoming a professional athlete, wiped out the entire assumption of, hey,
Thinking out of the box, I like it. All right. So I'm going to move on. Except there were a few other questions here. Of course, these, I think everyone got this right, or the comments that were shouted out. These have exactly the same probability of occurring. And the answer to this one we've already talked about. Yet another element that makes us not very good risk decision makers is that we don't get timely feedback. This is one of the biggest problems for learning in general, not just in the context of risky decision making. To learn and to learn effectively and quickly, we need timely objective feedback. We need it delivered constructively as well. But even if it's not delivered constructively, as long as it's timely and it's accurate and objective, it can be very helpful to us. Because the moment when we've made the decision and applied it, that's when our minds are most receptive to getting that feedback and learning from it and not making that same mistake in the future. So timely feedback, hugely important. We want it to be objective and meaningful. So the upshot of that is that we should surround ourselves with good people we trust. This applies both in our personal lives and certainly in professional lives. We want to be surrounded by people whose word we can take and who respect us enough to tell us the truth. Again, those of you who have been in work circumstances may know, and personal circumstances, there are times when it's not easy to provide that harsh, truthful feedback. But it's hugely important. And of course, it's easier for us to be with people who will be yes people, who will tell us what we want to hear instead of what we need to hear. So we can choose whom to surround ourselves with in our personal lives. Don't have as many choices when it comes to the business world, but we can at least do our part by being honest, constructive, and telling the truth. And we also tend to outsource decision-making quite poorly. So we elect and appoint leaders precisely because we want them to make the difficult decisions that we're unwilling or incapable of making. And if you think about it, that's why we have those leaders. We don't elect people or appoint leaders to make easy decisions because we can either do that ourselves or someone with a reduced skill set can handle those. We elect leaders and we want them to be highly qualified so that when the day comes and there's a hugely important decision, they'll be there and be capable of making it, whether it's a political decision, business decision, whatever it is. So, and I think the leadership literature accepts this definition, that leaders are there to make the risky decisions. But of course, our leaders' decisions are only as good as our leaders. In particular, if we think about political leadership, I think a decent argument can be made that we don't feel we have very good leaders. It's not just my decision or my observation. The fact that Congress has had a 9% approval rating or something around that for years is stunning and terrifying and frankly embarrassing for us. Right? Because we believe them to be inept, but we're the dumb ones who elected them. Right? So turning that around now to something more constructive, we can help our society move forward with better decisions if we elect and create better leaders. And there's also questions regarding whether we create capable leaders for business, for political purposes, and so on. So that introduces last topic, that of leadership risk, which ties very neatly into some of those most recent slides. Our leaders expose us to leadership risk. This wasn't on the earlier taxonomy of different risks that I had outlined. I mentioned there are many others. This is one that I don't know whether I coined this phrase, but I've been using it, and I have a website dedicated to it. I think it's a tremendously important concept. It is very similar to strategic risk, for those of you who may have seen definitions of that. But this in particular refers to the leaders themselves. And this is the risk of loss or damage due to poor decision-making by our leaders. Leadership risk arguably is the most important risk there is, because with good leadership as a society, we can thwart a lot of the other risks. With bad leadership, all hell breaks loose. They make bad decisions which hurt us directly. They make bad decisions which their juniors learn from, so that all of that poor decision-making capability is now trickling down through an entire organization, whether it's a corporate organization, government organization, what have you. And now the junior people are picking up bad habits. So it's hugely important for us to develop the right leaders. And I'll leave you with a final thought. What are you specifically going to do about this? We like to think that at this school, this is part of what we're about. We want to help you find the leader within and have that leader serve the community. So I'll end here. I'll look exactly on time. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to be around, so if you have any questions for me, please ask. I'll be at the lunch as well. And have a good day.